That was back in 2019. And the reason that we launched legal action against the government of Ontario is they were forcing Ontario parents who declined even one vaccine for their child to attend school to sign an affidavit that said that they were knowingly putting their child's life at risk. And if they didn't sign that affidavit, they didn't get an exemption, and their child couldn't attend school. They also forced every parent who declined even one vaccine to attend an education session to get their mind right. So at Vaccine Choice Canada, we felt they had gone too far. You may not know the history of Vaccine Choice Canada. We actually began in 1982. Ontario was the first government in Canada that mandated childhood vaccines for kids to go to school. And the legislation that was introduced in 1982 had no provision for personal belief or religious exemption, which meant that every child had to be vaccinated. A group of parents fought that legislation for 2 years, and in 1984, ironically the same year as my son was injured, they got new legislation introduced that allowed for personal belief and religious exemptions. That happened because a group of parents stood up to the government and refused to comply with those illegal mandates. There's one other province in Canada that has vaccine mandates for kids to go to school, New Brunswick. And in 2019, they had personal belief and religious exemptions, and they introduced new legislation to remove personal belief and religious exemptions. Hard to believe that in 2019, we're taking away exemptions and forcing vaccines on our children. So Vaccine Choice Canada brought in a number of international experts and Canadian experts to present to a subcommittee that was formed to hear expert evidence on the safety and efficacy of vaccines. And we were given 3 days to provide testimony. Each speaker got to speak for 30 minutes exactly. And I have to say that for the first 2 days, it felt like we were participating in an exercise of futility. It felt like they had already made their decision. They were going to move this legislation forward, and they were just giving the illusion of democracy, of public input. But something happened on the third day. The public health officer was testifying about why it was important to introduce these vaccine mandates, and the argument made was because there were 11 cases of measles in the province of New Brunswick. Now, we had a few of the legislative elected members that were actually working with us. They were on our side, and they would ask us to provide them with some questions that they could put forward. So one of the questions we put forward and suggested they ask the public health officer is, of those 11 children that got measles, how many of them were vaccinated? So what do you think the public health officer said? I can't give you that information because it's private. So the MLA persisted, and they said, well, listen, I'm not looking for names. I'm looking for a number between 0 and 11. And again, the public health officer refused. And you could have heard a pin drop when she refused to give that information. And the legislators looked at each other, and they knew something was wrong. And as it went forward, they defeated that bill. We did a Freedom of Information request to find out how many of those 11 children were vaccinated. 9 of 11 were fully vaccinated. 1 was partially vaccinated, and 1 was unvaccinated. But it took us a year to get that information. That's the tyranny we're living in Canada today. And it just didn't start 4 years ago. It didn't start in 1982. It's been going on, at least with vaccines, for 225 years. I had the pleasure of interviewing Dr. Suzanne Humphreys last week as part of Vaccine Choice Canada live interviews that we do. And she wrote the book, Dissolving Illusions. And she was a nephrologist and working in a conventional hospital. And she saw, her job is people that have severe kidney disorders and require dialysis, and her job is to get them back to state of health. And what she was noticing is that her patients that were doing well all of a sudden would suddenly just, their health would decline. And she tried to figure out what was happening. What she noticed is when she wasn't paying attention, they were vaccinating her patients with the flu vaccine. And so she went to the chief administrator and she asked them to stop doing that to her patients because they were causing a problem. And they effectively, over a course of time, pushed her out of that hospital for saying she didn't want her very sick patients injected with the flu vaccine. And at that point, she believed in vaccines, and so she decided to do her own research. And she looked at the first vaccine, then the next one, then the next one, and the next one, and she decided all of them are a problem. And they are. We're being lied to on a massive scale. We're being deceived. And the lie is just not about vaccines. The lie is bigger than that. You know, Arthur said that Canada is fallen, and it has. Umar said that we're not living in a democracy, and we're not. Those are all lies. We have a lot of work to do. One of the lies that I am most offended by is what they're telling our pregnant moms about the COVID shot. And so, again, beautiful citizens who just rise up to the occasion to do their homework began to collect the evidence from the Pfizer-Moderna contracts with the government of Canada. They went and looked at the actual evidence. They filed Freedom of Information requests. And then they compared that information to what our public health officials were saying on TV. And I want to show you that clip to show you how badly they lied to us. If you would run that, please.
For the vaccine clinical trials, didn't include pregnant women, certainly these initial clinical trials. But there's no biological reason why the vaccine wouldn't be effective and safe during pregnancy. The National Advisory Committee on Immunization has also said, look, we know that the clinical trials didn't include this group, but
Everybody who's pregnant, when your vaccine time comes up, it absolutely is something that you should do, and we do encourage that. There's lots of good data now that supports they are safe and effective in pregnancy. And just last week we had a study that showed that protective antibodies are transmitted through breast milk to the infant as well. So I encourage all pregnant women. I can say unequivocally these vaccines do not affect fertility, both in women or in boys or in young men. They do not affect fertility. There's no way that they can do that.
There's no reason to be worried about impacts on fertility from the COVID-19 vaccines. Theoretically, we're not worried about it. There's no reason that the reproductive system would be involved in the response to the vaccine. And we also have more than a year's worth of data that shows us that there's no association or concern on fertility and pregnancy outcomes from the COVID-19 vaccine.
There is good safety data so far with the vaccines in pregnancy, and no reason to believe that we will see concerns, particularly related to pregnancy.
COVID-19.
But it is also safe. It has been tested. We are recommending that women who are pregnant do receive the vaccine for the protection of themselves, protection of their baby as well. And that is has been proven. It has been accepted by the Health Canada, by the World Health Organization, by the FDA. And this is something that we want to make sure that we can protect everyone. Women who are pregnant, it is entirely safe and recommended for them to receive the vaccine for themselves, their own protection, the safety of their loved one.
So this is the first time this video is being shown. It was done at 2 o'clock in the morning last night. And it was done by people in this room. You know, there are those that say, you know, our government is broken, our courts are broken, our law enforcement is broken, our media is broken. That's one way of looking at it. The other way is to say it's doing exactly what it's intended to do. I think Canada's in a lot of trouble. And I think we need to recognize that we're on the edge of a cliff. And if we don't stand up real fast and defend our rights and freedoms and take responsibility for this country, not only will we lose Canada, but we will lose our humanity. And so this is a call to action. And I want to honor all of you because you're here because you heard the call. And we might think that we need everybody to be on board. We don't. We just need enough of us to be loud and strong and solid in our authority. If I have any criticism of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, it's that I think we should have called it the Charter of Rights, Responsibilities, and Freedoms. With every right, there's a responsibility. And I'll take my own, ask for penance for my own lack of responsibility. I didn't do the homework to make an informed decision for my son's vaccination, but I also haven't been what I now realize is a responsible citizen of this country. I haven't participated as I ought to in the accountability that's required if we're going to live in a free and just society. And I suspect many of you would also own that guilt. We thought somehow having a piece of paper that said what our Charter of Rights and Freedoms were was enough. Turns out it's not. We thought that voting every 4 years was enough, and it's not. One of the things that I'm most disturbed by is that this decline in Canada happened on my watch. It happened in my lifetime. And I think we all need to look at how did we get to this place where we missed the destruction of our country. I believe what we're witnessing is a controlled demolition. And what they've got in mind for us is full enslavement. And there are many people that can't hear this message because it's too dark. The lie is too big. But it's the truth. At the National Citizens Inquiry that we just recently held in Regina, Alan Hinsberger was one of the witnesses that testified, and I don't know how many of you know Alan, but he started up the first Christian radio station in Canada many years ago, 40 or 50 years ago. And then he started up the first Christian TV station in Canada. And so he was one of our witnesses. And after he testified, one of the questions that was asked of him by the commissioners is, why would God let this happen? And Alan said, so we can see how evil really is. I think this is actually an incredible time. The bad news is we've been lied to. The good news is we're starting to recognize that. I believe this is part of humanity's awakening. As I said, my career and my profession was a psychotherapist. And so I worked with people that came in every day that were suffering. And one of the things that I learned is that the suffering would push them to look at things that they didn't want to look at. And through the work of confronting what was happening in their life and helping them to take some responsibility for it, their lives transformed, and they often moved to a place of living much happier, richer, more fulfilling lives. But a key piece of it was taking responsibility. Almost everybody would come into my office and they'd say, would you help me change my wife? Or would you help me change my husband? Or would you help me change my kids? And I'd say, no, I can't do that. But if you would like to change, I can help you with that. I came to the understanding that suffering is the gateway to wisdom. And what I'm hopeful about is that the suffering that is happening now is global. No one is escaping the suffering. And even if they don't admit it, they're suffering. And through that suffering, I believe that we are coming to understand what's really important. And it's not being able to travel or go to the bar or all those kinds of things. There's something even more important than that. It's not even about our health. It's about our freedom. It's about our dignity. It's about our humanity. And maybe we had to lose those things, or they had to be so severely threatened before we finally recognized the threat and stood up and began to be different. In my work with people in my counseling practice, one of the things that I would do is I would try to assess their level of maturity. And the question I would basically ask in my head is, at what age are they acting like? Are they acting like a 40-year-old, or a 20-year-old, or a 12-year-old, or a 6-year-old? And part of the reason that I would look for that information or that answer is I believe that trauma arrests our development. And if they were acting like a 12-year-old, then my question was, tell me what happened at the age of 12. And that question by itself often provoked crying, because it's like you put your finger on something that hasn't been healed. I think we've all been traumatized. I think we've got work to do that healing. But there's things that come before healing. And these are not my words. These are Grant Abraham. I've had his book out on the Vaccine Choice Canada table. Grant wrote a book called The Battle for the Soul of Canada. And he says, before you can get to healing, you have to have truth. And then you have to have justice. And then you can get to healing. The reason for censorship is because they don't want us to know the truth. I was given the opportunity to give closing remarks at the NCI that we had over the 3 days, and one of the statements that I made that came to my realization while listening to the hearings is that the world is divided into two people: those who want to know the truth and those who don't, but also those who want others to know the truth and those who don't want others to know the truth. We have to fight against the censorship. We have to fight against the deception. We have to fight against the lies. We have to fight against our own self-censorship. This is a time to be brave. This is a time to risk everything. As Jason Christoph said in that little video clip, I am not ruled by paper. And if I have to die to protect my children, I will. There's a map of consciousness. Would you put that slide on the screen, please? I don't know how many of you are familiar with the work of David Hawkins. He wrote the book, many books, but one that I really liked is Power versus Force. And I have to admit that before I read his book, I didn't know the difference between power and force. I probably thought of those two things as the same. And they're very different. And what the government is doing to us is force. And when we stand in our authority, we have power. His thesis, his theory is that every emotion, every thought has a vibration. It has a frequency. And it's a low frequency or a high frequency. And he calibrated emotions and thoughts on a scale between 0 and actually 1,000. I've just taken a condensed chart of his map of consciousness. And I think you might find this very interesting. The lowest emotion is shame. Isn't it interesting how throughout the mandates, what they tried to do is shame us? They know exactly what they're doing. Guilt, make us feel guilty. Fear. We talked about anger yesterday. There's a place for anger. But what I think is important is that we actually be in charge of our anger instead of our anger being in charge of us. I suspect when Pastor Arthur was angry and yelling at those Nazis, he knew exactly what he was doing. He was fully in charge of that. He was coming from a place of love, but he used anger as a tool. But if you're stuck in anger, that's a whole different story. That line is the difference between disease and health. If you're functioning below the line, you're going to get sick. If you move above the line, you start to get healthy. And so the first thing over the line is courage. Interesting, huh? You move up. Willingness, acceptance, love, joy, peace. The reason that Trudeau had to shut down the trucker convoy is because the amount of love that was in Ottawa. That's what made him so afraid. And the reasons Canadians came out onto those highway overpasses on the side of the roads is they felt the love. Nobody had to tell them that. They could feel it. They were drawn to it. It was interesting noticing on the Friday night when we had a dinner for folks, and I watched all the selfies happening as people got to see each other and want to have their picture taken with different people. And I thought, do you know who has the most selfies being asked for in the entire group? Chris and Tamara. And I thought, we had Dr. Peter McCullough, Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, we had Dr. Drew Pinsky. We had all of these people that so-called have international recognition. And who did people want to have their picture taken with? Tamara and Chris. That says something about us. We got this, but we have to recognize this is ours. Nobody's coming to rescue us. If we think it's Pierre Poilievre, it's not. If we think it's John Rustad, it's not. If we think it's anybody else, it's not. And if we think that our work is about changing somebody else, I would suggest please look at yourself in the mirror and ask the question, what do I need to do different? What am I holding on to that's not true? What do I need to let go of? What am I afraid of? How can I stand taller? Where am I giving away my authority? Where am I giving away my power? I would suggest our work is to be the best we can be. And that's how we'll change this world. As I said a few minutes ago, I actually think this is a transformative time. This has the potential to transform humanity to a different level of consciousness. And I would invite you to embrace every moment of this. This is a remarkable time. And not only do we get to meet incredible people who have demonstrated how to stand up, but it's also a time that we discover how incredible we are. God bless you all. Thank you.